Hey everyone, I've got Anthony Taylor here of Taylor Home Comfort. He
Yeah.
is an HVAC expert who is in the area and has been kind enough to share his expertise with us. And I'm going to start in, Anthony, with the big question, pricing. Do you want to weigh in on this issue? Everyone is concerned about pricing, especially with HVAC units.
Pricing has a lot to do with the type of equipment that you get. I know that there's concerns all the time about, what's built in after the parts are in there. And I mean, the industry that I'm in does have a significant amount of overhead in it as far as insurance concerned, just because you're dealing with things like fuel, power, water. Those are all things that could be essentially detrimental to your house. So that can drive cost. But I think people are more or less concerned with why there's such a gap between companies as far as large scale and independent contractors, and then the ones that I like to call the Craigslist contractors. The Craigslist contractors, you're taking a shot in the dark. You have a chance that maybe they are someone that works for a reputable company and they have good experience and they're just doing it for some side work. But then again, you also have the people that are operating without insurance and maybe don't know everything that they should, as far as when they're installing this, because the most important day in any HVAC system's life is the day that it was installed. So if it wasn't put in correctly because there was a lack of experience or knowledge, then it could essentially cost you more money in the long run. Then you have people that are on the far end of the spectrum where they have lots of billboards and brightly colored trucks, and they cost a lot more because they advertise a lot and they need to sell these bigger jobs in order to make up for, some gaps with other salesmen, technicians, or even their office staff that essentially cost them a lot in payroll every month and year. And I think that's why you have such a big gap between those two. Most of the people that are in the middle of the road, the reasonable prices like myself, were at most usually 5 to 10% off of one another.
Okay. So, and I think that's really interesting. I describe it a lot in a very similar way with contractors. I like your Craigslist contractor. Is that what you said?
Craigslist contractors.
Yeah, that's catchy. It's kind of like the jack of all trades, master of none.
Right.
I'm kind of the jack of all trades, master of none, but I still don't work on my system.
Nor would you want to. I mean, there's a lot of licensing involved and stuff too. And, you could be asking for a problem just by essentially turning the wrong component.
Yeah, and I could definitely see that. And when it comes to some of these, I mean, I just think of like whether it's the little things, like if you put if you have a heat pump and you have the exchange unit, which is the giant box outside. And correct me if I ever say something wrong, but people, if you have the box outside and it's not level, it's just sitting at an angle, doesn't that like decrease its life expectancy or reduce its efficiency or something like that?
Yeah, it was designed to be level from the factory for a couple of reasons, for vibration and harshness of the actual compressor shaking on the actual casing itself, and they usually have rubber isolators on them. And if you weigh it off to one side, you could essentially be putting some unnecessary strain on solder joints, on bolts, and as that pan starts to rust out, you have the chance that it could end up breaking out of the pan and then, developing leaks. Not only that, but the oil that's in the system is now going to start pooling. And if it starts pooling and restricting the refrigerant, then it's just essentially going to be costing you money that you don't even realize, and cutting its life expectancy.
Well, see, and that's such a trivial example in my opinion. And I can't say that every time it's not level, it's because of the person who installed it or put it in there. But
Now,
just
groundwater
messing up.
shifts it more than anything.
What's that?
Groundwater shifts them more than
You
anything.
think
You
so?
could put it
Okay.
in a pad.
But see, that's
Great.
why I bring it up. Those little nuances, the things that you don't expect or you're not thinking about as a homeowner, never cross your mind. But a guy like yourself will see it and say, "Oh, you know what? This is messed up." I had worked on one of my units for a while, and they just the wiring got messed up, and it was a problem. It was an ongoing problem, and you don't want that to be an issue with your heat because, as my wife can attest, nobody is happy when we have no heat.
No.
So don't mess around, people. So we've got the low end stuff, like you're saying, the Craigslist
Yep.
Craigslist contractors, and then the high end stuff. You're saying, okay, so they're basically, I don't want to say gouging, but their prices are higher because they have more overhead, right? It's a
Correct.
more bloated organization. Somebody's paying for that truck. Who's paying for that truck? I'm paying for that truck.
Exactly.
Okay. And don't get me wrong, people, there's a time and a place for every tool is kind of my opinion. But that's where your niche is, right in the middle. You're saying, look, I don't have all this crazy overhead, but I'm also not a fly by night guy. This is literally how I feed my family and pay my bills, just doing HVAC. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And when we're in your bracket, they're within that 5 to 10% range, if I heard you correctly.
That's a number that's based on opinion. I mean, I don't see too many outfits, my size and quality that seem to vary too much more than about 10%. I mean, I've sat on, multi-level bids with contractors, same level where the customer didn't want to use anybody that they could find just by opening up any, advertising magazine, but they also didn't want to use somebody that they weren't sure of. So they got a good mix of us. And I saw some of the prices afterwards because some of those bids that, I have won. And I'd say, like I said, 5 to 10% off each one.
Yep. Well, that makes sense. I mean, my wife's business, she's in the editing industry, and there are a couple groups that we're familiar with. We've seen what they've charged, and it's like 5 times as much as we are. And there's no difference in the service, like when we've evaluated. And we're inferring it's because of like the overhead or what the profit margin they're expecting. It's not like she makes a killing off it, but she gets paid for her service. She doesn't undercut herself. She's a professional, and I view it as the same thing basically as what you're saying here with HVAC. So the pricing, if we're looking for someone of your ilk, of your stature, in terms of like experience, knowledge, expertise, and proficiency, you're going to all be in that same range. If we see somebody like on all the billboards running up and down Route 309, odds are they're going to charge us more than you would. Is that correct?
Most likely.
Yeah. Okay. What about neighborhood? So I've heard rumors of this. When you go into an expensive neighborhood, does pricing change?
No, not for me. I have a strict flat rate business model where I take the cost of the components, I take the tax that's involved in it, and then the fuel that I know it will take me to get to the supply house to get it. And that's your parts cost that I put in there. There's daily operating costs that go into it too, like insurance, advertising and phone, and my stuff is lower, but it all needs to be considered. But the only thing that will drive the cost is if you're outside of my range. And my range is usually 30 to 35 miles from where we are in Boyertown. So I'll go all the way over, to the deep parts of Bucks County, Delaware County, Chester County. But if you're past that, say we're going up towards the Poconos, I've done a job up that direction. Of course, that had to drive my cost because I'm not going to come back after I drive 2 hours one way, spend all day on a job, and then have to go back again the next day. I just had to stay up there. So legit costs come into it more than anything. But I'm not going to say that I haven't heard of other contractors increasing prices based on neighborhoods. So, I mean, if you get a bad feel and you think maybe it's a salesy tactic, it never hurts to get a second opinion. Not saying that that's what they're doing, but, having a couple of contractors always helps.
Sure. Yeah. And you can't make a statement, like a blanket statement saying that every contractor does it all the time. But
no.
There have been a couple of times when I said, boy, that doesn't sound right. I would definitely get a second quote. But, I still put thinking about what we're talking about here, I would rather pay a contractor that I know and have me pay him the extra fuel and mileage to drive an extra 30 minutes to get the job done right than risk it on somebody I pull out of the yellow pages or whatever the kids are using these days, to find contractors, because the liability, whether it's a Craigslist contractor or just somebody who messes it up, I mean, the expense associated with having somebody come out and fix it after it was done wrong the first time is far greater than the expense associated with just paying somebody a couple extra minutes to drive down the road. So that's interesting. All right. What about, let me go back to my notes. Different heat sources. So everyone assumes that propane and natural gas are the most efficient and the most cost effective. Do you want to weigh in on this? And obviously, you can't make a blanket statement everywhere because pricing changes from area to area. Like it might be more expensive here or cheaper here than New Jersey, but in our general area, Bucks, Montgomery, Lehigh, Northampton counties, those kind of areas. What is your opinion on which source of heat we should be, I guess, prioritizing?
Well, when it comes to just general availability, I mean, natural gas is abundant. I mean, you have multiple propane companies that are able to make and supply it, and cost varies from company to company. And it's the same thing when you talk about installing heating and air conditioning units, the people that are supplying the fuel for it can sometimes be astronomical. And then you can have the ones that are reasonable and pretty much the same across the board. Um, I mean, there's a lot of different factors to that question. So dollars to BTU is a big one, but then with all the increasing efficiencies of the new systems, it's tough to get a gauge on it right now, just because you need to see an extended sample size of how long they run for. But as a general term, natural gas is usually your most efficient form of heat if you have it available to you. Following that, there's a pretty close tie between some of these modulating variable speed refrigerant systems and then propane. But propane still tends to narrow it out a little bit as long as you have reasonable pricing per gallon for your propane. And then obviously after that, oil, oil is a fuel that dollars per BTU, it's extremely efficient. But where it's going to cost you is that you need to have the system cleaned every year. And a lot of companies are anywhere between $200 to $400 to clean it. And then your oil companies that supply you the oil, I don't want to call it a dying industry, but it's certainly one that isn't as abundant as it used to be. Just with all of your gases that are more readily available. So it's definitely been on a little bit of a decline. So that has driven some of the oil prices up and down. Some of them are driving down because they're trying to earn your business, and others are just going up because they're one of the only suppliers in their area.
Yeah, no competition. So it's easy to raise the price then.
Yep.
That's interesting. So natural gas, then propane, maybe some of the those other forms you're referencing. What about electric? I had a big conversation about that with some people recently, and weigh in either about electric baseboard or the heat pump systems or some of the other ones that you may be thinking of.
It really depends on the area that you're in. So power suppliers are going to come into that one. If you have a very low cost power supplier, some of your PP&L and Pico prices are pretty low for electric. And if you're living in a small space, electric baseboards is definitely, I would call it an efficient option, because you're not going to pay as much to have a system installed. You're just going to have to run essentially a few circuits to a few baseboards throughout your house, and you can still adequately heat it, but it won't be as uniform throughout your house as far as the temperature is concerned. You don't really have the availability to really dial in the temperature and balance it between the rooms. Heat pumps, which are electric, they are efficient, and they're getting even more efficient, especially with any of your variable speed refrigerant systems. So that means that the system itself, it converts your alternating current in the outdoor unit to a direct current. So simply put, it's just changing the way that the power is coming to the compressor outside. So now it can change its speeds, whereas back in the day, paying for a two-stage system was obviously a lot more expensive. Well, now we have variable speed systems that are right on par with your mid-tier systems, and they can adjust their speed, some of them as much as 60 different increments, at 1% each time. So they're very efficient. And in my opinion, they're going to be what everybody else is going to step up their development on, is variable refrigeration systems.
It doesn't surprise me. I was talking to a propane guy, and he said it was like I don't know what the terms are, but they had multi-stages, I guess, to the blower and how much propane they were throwing in. And when we started talking about the BTUs, because I'm a big fan of that, how much heat am I actually generating for the amount of fuel that I'm putting in? He was like, well, your BTUs are actually lower. And I said, well, if my BTUs are lower, why is it not more efficient? He was like, well, because really the difference is we might not be burning as hot on this unit because we're throwing less fuel in there. But what we're also not doing is having as much entropy or loss heat through the flue. And he said that's really the secret. He's like, propane burns at whatever temperature propane burns at. What we're trying to do is mitigate the amount of lost heat, the BTUs that go out of your house instead of stay in it. Right. And I guess, and I don't know what the percentages were, but it sounded like it was a pretty substantial, like 10 to 20% in like a standard one-phase propane system that were going out. And he said when we got into the more efficient ones, we were down below 5%. And he was like, it's better. He's like, you're just not blowing the hot air out and heating your backyard. You're just heating your inside, which is nice. I didn't know they were doing that with heat pumps. That's awesome.
Yeah, heat pumps, all they're really doing is they're giving you that availability. So if you have a 3-ton heat pump system,
Yeah.
that was rated at a certain ambient temperature outside. And as that temperature goes down, your available BTUs for that go down pretty significantly or pretty drastically with it. So by having a variable speed compressor, you can now increase the speed of that refrigeration or that refrigerant moving through the system and then make up for those lost BTUs.
So it's like you're blowing a fan through it or something. It's not a really good metaphor, but like I'm not sure how to describe it. I
Pushing more
understand what you
pressure
said though.
through.
Yeah, well, no, you can go with the exact words. I prefer to twist them. So is that the
More
future
to it
then
than
of
just that, though.
what's that?
There is a lot more to it than that. I don't want people to think I'm short-sighting the subject, but
No,
the
I appreciate you distilling it because I mean you've already reached the limits of my knowledge. Is that the future of HVAC that everything is going to go like multi-speed, even
I
with
think
our
so.
natural gas systems?
I think so. I think a lot of it's going to move that direction, just because a lot of it already has. And every X number of years, the Department of Energy and the EPA all come out with new guidelines on how efficient these systems need to be. So, for an example, July of last year was put into place that all of the new furnaces and air handlers had to get rid of the original single speed style fan that they had and replace them with an ECM style fan because that was the most energy drawing portion of the indoor unit. So by replacing that, I'm not sure of the exact percentages, but there was a pretty significant percentage in efficiency that was increased.
But that's not something that makes sense for me to retrofit my system.
No,
That's
if you have
just
a
when I
system
get a
that's
new
already in
one, I
your
should be
house,
thankful.
right, you're not going to gain that much more by replacing it right now with one of those. It just means all the newer systems from this point forward, the manufacturers have to use this as a baseline.
Yep. Very cool. Very cool. There was something else I was going to bring up, but it slipped my mind. If it comes back, I'll swing back. What about geothermal and any of the eco-friendly stuff? What's your opinion on that?
I would use eco-friendly and geothermal loosely together, just because there's a
Okay.
lot of excavation that's involved with it. So you're going to pay a lot of money for one to have that loop field installed into your yard.
If we're going geothermal, you mean, right?
For geothermal, yes.
Okay, so eco-friendly could be anything that's efficient. I guess the things they're installing now with the multi-phases is going to be more eco-friendly, is what your
Right.
point is.
Right. Any more energy efficient systems are going to be better, environmentally, because less fuel is being burned, less exhaust is going out, less power is being sent into your home coming from a power plant. So, but as far as the geothermal topic's concerned, I mean, one, you deal with a lot of digging and excavating and then repairing whatever property you're putting that loop field in, because they have water and an antifreeze that goes inside them. So the way that they work is a heat pump uses the ambient air outside in order to exchange that heat, to create heat or to dissipate heat. Now with geothermal system, we're now using groundwater, which should stay at a relative temperature of 40 degrees. So it's just like having that heat pump always be in a 40-degree environment.
Mm.
But you also have miles, no, maybe not miles, you have hundreds and hundreds of feet of these pipes that are outside that have to act as your condenser. So your ground is your condenser now on a very large scale. And you have to pump all that water into a pumping system and then into that air handler in order to be able to exchange that heat inside your house.
And that's the additional expense, or one of them that you're referencing, because now somebody needs to bring in a backhoe and literally move tons of dirt
Right.
to build the condenser underground instead of just having a unit that's already prefabricated from a warehouse shipped out to your site.
Yeah, I
So
mean,
between
depending
all
on what
that,
contractor you use for your excavation, I mean, it's not uncommon to see some of these bills with installing the system, the ductwork, the loop field, and all your excavation costs, and then trying to repair your yard afterwards. You could be looking $40,000 to $60,000 for a system when I could put in a variable speed heat pump with brand new ductwork for $15,000 to $20,000.
yeah,
So,
double the expense. It's going to be hard to recoup that.
yeah.
But it sounds cool.
Yeah, absolutely. The concept's brilliant because you're keeping that temperature of heat exchange at the same temperature. So the efficiency is always going to be there. But I mean, when you boil it down to numbers and when you would actually get that money back
Yep.
from the efficiency that you have, would take a lot longer, then that system is most likely going to live inside your house.
Is that the same reason why radiant floor heat is so uncommon?
Radiant
Because it's
floor
so
heat.
expensive to build? Because isn't that the
So
same principle? You run pipes underneath like flooring to heat the floor, so the floor heats the house?
yeah, and you have to do it in a very uniform manner because then you can end up having cold and hot spots. And then there's always a delicate balance involved with those as well. So I've installed radiant floor heat on a commercial level for concrete to keep it dry, like in
Mm.
fertilizer plants and stuff like that. And then even in some shops because they use that as their sole source of heat. But these loop fields have to be, you know, pretty close together, and your measurements and all your piping has to be very close to uniform. Otherwise, you could end up having a cold spot here and a hot spot here, and then you could end up having cracks in the concrete because of it. Then you have to also make sure that that water temperature is always at the same temperature, and you don't make it too hot because, God forbid, I put radiant floor heat in your home, and let's say the temperature valve or the mixing valve fails, well, and you end up getting 160, 100 degree water, 160 to 180 degree water that comes into your floor. Well, you could, one, do some damage to the material that your floor is made out of, and two, you could burn your feet in the process.
Geez, that never crossed my mind. But I can make some
Very
great eggs.
uncommon that it happens like that. We have a lot of mechanical safeties that we put in place.
Yeah.
But short answer, as far as cost is concerned, it's a lot more expensive because there's a ton of work that's involved in it.
Yeah. But it's really nice when it's there.
Absolutely. Yeah. You can step out onto your hardwood floor and not be freezing. I just prefer to put slippers on.
Oh, yeah. It's more cost effective.
More
That's
cost
for
effective.
sure. Let's keep going on this. I'm going to take a quick note here because I want to come back to an issue. But so we have radiant floor. What about radiators in general versus forced air systems? So it seems like a lot of the systems you describe, like natural gas, propane, heat pump, they're forced air systems, which is just a fancy way of saying it blows hot or cold air at you, versus radiators like the old oil furnaces that you see where they circulate them through the hot water. The hot water through like giant radiators that everyone knows. Is one better than the other? Should we be looking for forced air? Or is that just more efficient?
Forced air is just the direction that a lot of the systems are moving. You're never going to get rid of radiant heat because applications like I described, fertilizer plant needs their floor to be dry all the time. The best way to do that is with radiant heat. But when you talk about cast iron radiators are extremely hard to find anymore, and they're very expensive. The baseboards, on the other hand, are a lot more readily available. And the reason why they were such a big source of heat back in the day was just because it was extremely efficient to just heat up this water one time. It retains a lot of its heat inside there and the metals, and then it's very easy to run a pipe this big rather than a duct that's this big. And you can put those systematically throughout the house and heat it relatively uniform.
So it was more of a byproduct of the time than it was because that's not the right or a better system.
Mm-hmm. And some new houses that you see that have it, a lot of it's just whatever contractor ended up getting the heating and cooling bid. I mean, if they're primarily a plumbing company and that's what they know and they're good at, then you're probably going to get some type of a boiler system. And it's not a bad source of heat. It's a dry source of heat. So when you talk about the humidity in your house and like what I consider to be felt heat, you get a little bit less of that when you talk about it. And then you can end up having just typically dry air. And then obviously the other side of that is you can't air condition with radiators. So
we got to figure out how to do that. Why does it make the air so dry? Because I would have guessed you would have said the opposite.
What you're doing is you're increasing the heat just exponentially in the area around that radiator. And so if you increase the room for humidity in the air by expanding those molecules, so that balance is going to be off. The same amount of water is still going to be in there, but there's going to be more room for water. So your relative humidity drops significantly.
Interesting. So then what's the best system for maintaining humidity besides putting a whole house humidifier on?
I mean, you're talking about in a radiator application?
No, without a radiator. So
Without
any
radiator?
system that you're going to pick. The reason I ask is because dry air is a big issue in the winter. A lot of people complain about it. I wouldn't have guessed the radiator would have encouraged it, but when you explain it, it makes sense.
Right.
I hear a lot of people complain about electric baseboards making the air dry as well.
Yep.
I'm guessing that's the same principle.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't hear it as much about heat pumps or propane or natural gas or like a forced oil system. But I'm assuming that's just because they're not suffering from the radiator phenomenon that you're referring to. Is that correct?
Correct. Right.
Okay. Are
So
you a big fan of whole house humidifiers since I brought it up?
I am. Any new modern bypass systems are my favorite because they're not very complex. I mean, steam is the best form of humidity you can put in your house because you can maintain it to a very small window of percentage. But any of your bypass style humidifiers, they just have a filter or a media block that you change every year, and there's very little that can go wrong with them. A lot of your older styles, they kind of held the water, and if you hold water in a dark environment for too long, you can start growing some things in it, which nobody wants in their airstream.
No.
But any of the newer style, it's designed to have all that water exit in a perfect application. I mean, you're going to get a little bit that stays there, but
Sure.
that's a small trade-off when you talk about having a good amount of humidity in your air, so that way you don't crack wood trim, warp any wood floors, have bloody noses or dry skin, and then not to mention all the static that you can get from it as well.
Yeah, my daughter and I got a nice picture of that at the beginning
Yeah.
of winter. I didn't quite catch the science of it, but that's okay. Basically, new whole house humidifiers, good. Old ones, not so good.
That's a good.
And is there any way to take humidity out of the house, or is that a component of them? They just add it if it's too dry. Is that correct?
There's a lot of different ways you can take humidity out of a house. You can do a ventilation system.
Okay.
You can do an air conditioning system running on low speed, or if you have a really bad humidity problem, you can put in a whole house dehumidifying system where that runs in and just exchanges the air like an AC unit would.
Interesting. Because that's the flip side. People say, oh, I don't want dry air. But then every now and then when they see the whole house humidifier, they say, yeah, but that makes my air too moist. To which I say, there's typically a dial. You can just shut it off or turn it down. But if you're concerned about it, which understandably, you can be concerned about it. If the humidity, I had a mold guy say, if the humidity is over 50% for 2+ days, you can actually have mold start spontaneously growing in your house. That's bad.
Absolutely.
Nobody wants mold.
Nobody wants mold.
No, unless it's like with cheese or something. But even then, specific types.
Right.
So that's interesting. So, all right, now I want to jump onto this one. This one is something I used to understand, but I have outgrown. Not to pass any judgment, but propane and natural gas, are they going to blow me up? I'm sorry. We're not laughing at people. We've all been there, or at
No,
least I've been
it's a
there. Maybe you
question.
haven't.
I have some customers where that's a very big concern when I install the systems is, when you think about gas, you think about leaks and you think about
Yeah.
any type of combustion going on where you don't want it to happen. The likelihood of that happening is low. I don't want to call it impossible because nothing's impossible.
Okay.
But in order for you to have that, I mean, there's a lot of fail safes on new systems.
Mm-hmm.
As far as reading the combustion air that's coming into the system, you have some of them that'll detect whether or not the pressure has dropped and turn the gas valve off. But running the gas line itself, you should always make sure that you have a qualified and certified contractor that goes through, they air test the system, they do a leak down check on the system prior to putting any type of fuel through it. Now, if that pipe itself gets to the flash point or the too hot, it'll never explode inside that pipe unless there's air that's getting into it.
Mm.
So that fuel needs air in order for it to create combustion. So that pipe by itself, I mean, your likelihood of it exploding inside your house is very low. If it does, it's because you have a leak somewhere and that that gas is getting out and then coming in contact with a flame, a spark, a hot surface. So the best practice is to make sure, if you smell gas, turn it off.
Sure. And that's also why they say, at least in my experience, they require carbon monoxide detectors in any house that has these fuel sources. Isn't that correct?
That won't help for the actual gas itself, but it will help with exhaust.
Okay.
So in the event that you have a furnace that has a bad heat exchanger, what can happen is that the combustion that you're keeping sealed from the air that you're breathing could enter that air, and nobody wants that because carbon monoxide is very much a silent killer.
Yes.
And too much of it, and you might not make it to the next day. But
Fall asleep.
keeping them in the rooms where you sleep, and one on every floor, and specifically the one or one of them on the floor where that system is a very good practice to have. Whether you have oil, propane, natural gas, wood fired, doesn't matter. If it makes a fire, you should have a carbon monoxide detector in multiple rooms throughout your house.
Okay. So then how do I know if I have a gas leak?
If you have a gas leak, well, additives are added to natural gas and propane to be extremely strong at low levels of gas. And those numbers, I'm not going to quote anything and
That's okay.
make myself inaccurate, but
what does it smell like?
To really
cheeseburgers?
Usually like rotten eggs.
Oh, okay.
There's a very strong sulfur smell that's added to them.
Yeah, that's okay. My son came to me yesterday and he said, and he was talking about like it was like some random thing. He was like, and I'm going to make it smell like cheeseburgers. Of course you are. Like completely nonsense. So rotten.
I wouldn't want a fuel to smell like anything savory.
Yeah, well, there is that. That's funny.
Any of those smells are designed to be unpleasant, so that way, even if you're, let's say, a light sleeper, it should get your attention to know that there's something that's not right.
Right. Yeah, and I do remember one occasion. I mean, more than one occasion, I've smelled it. There's been many times when I've gone into a building that was vacant, and you walk in and you start to recognize the smells. This is mold, this is gas, this is sewer, and you start to spot it. There's only been one case where we spotted it in our house, and if I remember correctly, it was because we were at like 10% or 8% of our propane tank. And I guess there's like an extra additive or extra layer they throw in at the bottom to let you know you're running low. Is that also correct? Or am I just getting a higher intensity of that?
You're going to get a stronger intensity because that additive is going to settle. And liquid propane will a lot of times build up a sediment in the bottom of it. So you never really want to run your propane tank completely dry.
I didn't mean to.
You can clog up the gas valve. The burners can get clogged. Anything mechanical that's in that system that has gas passing through it can end up suffering in the process.
Ours was actually a byproduct of purchasing the property. So I guess we purchased it. The level was low. We didn't check because the system was running. Right. So we were just like, it's fine. So they just ran it as low as they could to get by at the settlement. But for those who are wondering, your propane company typically will set up like a routine. It will come out every 6 months and they'll refill it. Like for us, we get down to, I want to say like 30 to 40%. And by that point, the 6 month refill rate has already come out. So they come out, they refill it. So you never really run out unless something goes wrong, like they stop delivering, or I don't know, you decide to run your furnace nonstop for 6 months straight. But even then, you have to do a lot of grilling to go through as much propane as we have. Here's another popular one. Now, I had a disagreement with some people about this. Filters. Which ones should we buy and why? Should we go with the really high-end stuff, the cheap stuff, or the reusable stuff?
There's definitely a lot of arguments for both sides. Depends on you as a person. What are you vulnerable to? Do you have strong dust agitation? Do you have underlying breathing conditions? And there's also a trade-off with the system. So your furnace and air conditioning systems, if you're restricting the amount of air that passes through there, what you're doing is you're limiting the amount of air that goes across that heat exchanger inside. And in turn, you could have a heat exchanger in a furnace gets too hot, an air conditioning coil that gets too cold because there's not enough air passing through it. It doesn't have enough exchange going on. My most common answer to that question is, I say, when you look at good, better, best, I always go somewhere in the middle. I don't go too high. I'm usually at like a MERV 8 to a MERV 11 at the most. But the number that you really need to be watchful for is when they tell you don't have to change your filter for 12 months. That's not true.
Okay.
Not true at all. You need to constantly keep an eye on that filter because it's all condition based. If you have your windows open more often, you're going to get more airborne particles from outside. You're going to get some dust from outside. If you have dogs, you're going to have hair that ends up inside there. Same thing with cats. I mean, the list, I could go on forever. When it's warmer outside, your kids are in and out more often, so more dirt's being tracked in that ends up in those filters. So that's probably my biggest concern with filters is the length of time that some of them see, how long they say that you can go without changing your filter.
Mhm.
and it's not accurate because I've had to replace some fan motors, replace some heat exchangers on some very young systems because the filters weren't ever changed.
So what should I look for? How should I know it's ready to go?
For the filter,
Yeah.
typically I set a reminder on a lot of people's thermostats so that way they don't need to remember to do anything. But I would check it at least once a month.
Oh,
If you're holding
well,
it up to the light and you're having a lot harder time seeing the light through it than when you first got it, it's time to change it.
okay.
But
So
as a
pick it
good rule
up
of thumb,
in front of the light, like just one of my lights in my basement.
right.
Okay.
And if you're having a lot harder time seeing through it, then you should probably change it. But a good rule of thumb is every 30 to 45 days on a filter that's 1 inch thick.
Oh, wow. That frequently? Because so most of the ones that I say like every 3 months, quarterly. Is that excessive? I'm killing my system slowly.
Not necessarily. Like I said, it depends on how much dirt's coming in and out of your house or in your air. So
Well, we're filthy people, so
I would at least check it every 45 days. I mean, if you end up just going with a basic pleated filter, it's not as expensive to replace those every 45 days,
yeah.
and your system's going to thank you for it.
Yep.
But if you have something where it's one of those thicker 4 inch filters, MERV 11 or 13, because you're concerned with particles in your air, I would still check them every 45 days just to see if, you had an influx of dirt that ended up inside there.
Hmm.
But I would still say, you can probably go like 3 to 5 months somewhere in that time frame, but it's all relative. Like I said, I don't want to marry myself to a number and someone doesn't change their filter for 5 months and then it goes bad.
No, I mean, you've got a great point in terms of like the seasonality. So I've also done it where I've said, okay, spring is over and now I'm going to, get rid of it because I'm looking at it and saying we just had a bad season with pollen or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
There have definitely been times when I pulled it out and I was like, oh my goodness, this is filthy. And other
Mm-hmm.
times when I was like, not so bad. But you know what? If you can buy one of the lower ones, it's a couple bucks for a
Right.
filter. It's not bad. When you get to the real high end stuff, that's where you can spend 10 to 15 plus dollars on a single one, at least in the sizes that I operate in. And that's a different story. But that's why I bring it up, because I was just trying to gauge your opinion on it. What about the reusable ones? I've seen those laying around Home Depot. They're like plastic webbing or something like that.
So my system actually has something that's like that because having a variable speed system with the
Uh-huh.
fan, it's going to be a little bit easier on it if you have just a more free flowing system where you're just trying to catch big particles. Not saying that I couldn't use another filter in it, but it definitely helps it breathe a little bit more freely and doesn't put as much strain on that fan motor. Um, so mine actually has a reminder on the thermostat. So when it senses the pressure differences and it's working harder and harder, and once it reaches a certain point, it'll pop up and say, time to wash the filter out.
Hmm.
If you can remember to wash them out and dry them out,
Mm-hmm.
then they're great. And if you're still concerned with air quality at that point, well, then we introduce things like ionizers so we can make those particles bigger and easier for your filter to catch. Or we can put things in like ultraviolet systems that are designed to kill bacteria and pathogens and airborne viruses. So the filter's not the catch-all end-all because stuff still makes its way past the outer edges of some of these filter racks.
So how does an ionizer work? Is that like those air filters we saw back in the 90s? Things blowing through and they just wiped it down with the cloth?
It's a similar concept. So there are electronic air cleaners like what you're talking about, where they have positive and negative,
Yeah.
and what they're designed to do is charge those particles in the air, so then they stick to whatever the negative or the positive is. It's opposite attraction to get it out of the air. And the theory behind electronic air cleaners is it's less restrictive on the system because the air can just flow right through it, and the particles should get sucked right to the sides. They're a lot more expensive, and when they go bad, sometimes parts aren't that easily available, and you end up having to replace the electronic air cleaner. But ionization, in theory, what it's supposed to do is take this dust particle, make it a positive, this one make it a negative. They should stick together. Now that they're a bigger particle, now my filter should be able to catch it a lot easier.
Gotcha. And then the UV light just kills all the living stuff. So like if there's bacteria floating around or viruses floating around, I mean, you're basically just zapping it until it becomes dead.
Yeah, so a lot of them have a very high first pass elimination rate for your viruses, bacteria, and pathogens. But it's important to remember, I mean, the ones that you can get at any big box store they're going to be of a different quality than something that I can get from a professional specific supply house.
Hmm.
So looking at reviews, looking at what other contractors have to say, and seeing what the descriptions and the product data from these manufacturers goes, it's a pretty important thing when you talk about doing air quality, because anybody can buy something cheap off of Amazon and put it in their system, but that doesn't mean that the electrical components inside are rated by
Right.
any type of certification industry. And then, you don't know if you're getting something that's working well or not. I mean, someone like me, I have air quality testers where I'll test it beforehand, recommend whether or not you should have it, and then I can test it after to see what kind of a difference it has made.
So basically you're saying if I go and I just grab a random UV light and throw it in there, it might not be strong enough. Stuff's just going to pour right through, not die, because you're basically given the bacteria a suntan instead of burning it to a crisp.
Well, I mean, any UV is definitely going to be effective, but the intensity definitely has a lot to do with how well it can eliminate that stuff from the air. And then on top of that, if you have, subpar electrical components that are going inside them, you
Mhm.
might not know how long it's going to last for you.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, I know we do a lot with that with wells and UV lights for cleaning water.
Hmm.
And the number one thing they say is like the light bulbs are rated for 15 months, so you replace them every 12.
Right.
Because the last thing you want is to have this great system operating and then it shuts down and now you've got dirty water running throughout your entire house. You can put the filter back in or the new light back in, but you now put it before where all the bacteria now are living. So like you can't go catch it in the future. I guess it might not work the same way in air, but neither here nor there. That's why we hire professionals. That's funny. Okay, so let's see. I want to talk about troubleshooting HVAC units, but first, can we touch briefly on what are HERS and SEER ratings? I talk about this occasionally. I don't consider myself an expert on them, but they have something to do with how efficient the unit in the house is, correct?
Correct. So SEER stands for Seasonal Energy Efficiency Ratio,
Hmm.
and then EER is Energy Efficiency Ratio. So EER is any type of heating system, and how, what level on the Department of Energy, their scale where it lands. And then your SEER rating is specific to air conditioning systems, just because it's a seasonal piece of equipment for you. So the higher efficiency you go with, the less money you're going to be spending on the utilities in the process.
Is there like a bar we should be hitting or something we should look at when we're checking out houses?
Well, there's minimums that are set forth by the EPA and the Department of Energy. So currently, the lowest SEER rating for a heat pump I can put in is a 14 SEER, and the lowest SEER rating for an air conditioning system is a 13 SEER. Back in the day, those numbers were significantly lower,
Hmm.
but that's one of the rolling adaptations of all those departments is they want to make sure that we're not putting in the same dinosaurs we did before and eating up the same amount of power that they used to.
Yeah. Yeah, that's much appreciated by the consumers, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Is there anything you want to mention else about the AC units? Like we kind of glossed over it because I just think HVAC and I kind of roll it all into one. Like I know heat pumps are technically air conditioners as well, but
Mm-hmm.
we haven't touched really on air conditioning at all. We're going into summer, so what should we know? What should we be on the lookout for?
One of the biggest things to know is that in January of this year, refrigerant number 22, R22, is no longer commercially available.
Okay.
So whatever suppliers have left, I'm sorry, whatever contractors have left, that's all they have. So if you have an R22 system for heating and air conditioning or for air conditioning alone, and you had any type of a leak, you could be paying a lot for refrigerant. And, I would very much prepare to update that system, because this will most likely be the year that I see the largest influx of updates. And I mean, any of the components that were available for them, they're very, very sparse.
So what is
So
that? What am I doing if I can't get the refrigerant anymore? I have to buy a new system if I run out?
if you run out and there's no one around that has it for you anymore,
Yeah.
um, and you're not looking to pay hundreds of dollars per pound for R22, then the unfortunate fact is an update would be, your best option.
That sounds like a walk around of yes, you would. Why do I have to, like, what's happening? So they're replacing it with something else. So you said R22. So what, are they replacing
R22
it with
was the
R23 now? What's
R22 was the refrigerant of its time. I can't remember exactly when it came into being used residentially and commercially, but the most common one now, any new systems are built with R410A.
okay?
And then they did an update. I mean, all of these refrigerants have some type of negative effect on the environment. That's why all of us have to have licenses from the EPA in order to be able to handle it, recover it, contain it. That's why you want to make sure you're picking the right contractor, because if they're going outside to that unit, they're just cutting that line and letting it go. Well, that's very much illegal,
Yeah.
and it's detrimental to the environment in the process. And then the oil that escapes is probably going to kill your grass, but the least of your worries. But 410A has been the replacement for R22. So, I mean, what more are you looking for as far as that answer is concerned?
Why are they replacing it? Is it just more environmentally friendly? Like, can I mix it in with my
More
cooling?
environmentally friendly, yes. I mean, all of them have, like I said, each one of them have goods and bads.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
R22 is an ozone depleting gas. R410A is a greenhouse gas. Both of them make things hotter outside, and it's a little bit easier on energy consumption for 410A. So
Okay.
because 410A operates at a higher pressure, it's a little bit easier for that compressor outside to be able to push that refrigerant and create that hot or cold air for you than it would be for an R22 system, where that compressor has to work a little bit harder. There's more amps flowing through that compressor, which means that your secondaries, so all of your energy that's coming from Pico and their power plants, well, they're burning more fuel to make you that energy so that you can do it. So that's why that one specifically is supposed to be more environmentally friendly.
Interesting. Okay. Well, then let's talk a little bit more about the HVAC, or the AC specifically. So somebody's AC unit's going to die in the next 2 months because it's going to get warm and somebody's not going to turn on. What should I do today? Okay. Yeah. What should I do besides call you immediately? Is there some like troubleshooting I can do?
Yeah, there's absolutely troubleshooting you can do. You can look for certain things prior to me coming out there that could save you that service call. So air conditioning systems, your heat is going to it's going to stay consistent, even if your filter is dirty. Air conditioning, on the other hand, has a more delicate balance for airflow. So if you start your air conditioner up and it's been 4 months and you've been heating the entire time, your heat was working fine, but now you need your air conditioner to run. Mm-hmm. Well, if it's plugged with dirt and no air is getting across it, you can end up freezing that evaporator inside your house. So one of the things I tell people to look for first is obviously a dirty air filter. If the air filter is dirty and you notice ice anywhere, you're going to have to turn that system off for a while. You can run the fan for a little bit, but don't turn the heat on. The last thing you want to do is shock the metals by introducing heat and ice at the same time. And then not to mention all the water that's going to trickle down into that furnace system. You don't want anything to do with that. You can also look for tripped breakers. Tripped breakers are usually a sign of either a short or you have a fan motor that's working really, really hard. I would only recommend people to reset that breaker once. If it continuously does it, that's when you need to call somebody to start looking at what the root of that problem is. And then finally, there's a lot of service switches that I see get flipped. So at the top of your stairs, since you have a propane system, you have a switch with a red plate that says gas burner on off.
Yeah.
I mean, if you end up having kids' friends over in the springtime, all of them are running around, they turn off the light to the basement. Well, they might have thought they turned the light off, but they turned your furnace off. Then you go to start your air conditioner.
Yeah.
You go to start that air conditioner and it doesn't work. So those are some simple things you can look for. A lot of times if a customer calls me, I'll walk them through a couple steps just to make sure that it's something that they actually need me for. And that's another way that I try to differentiate myself from some of the competition. It's a very limited list just because of liability, but I will walk you through the basics that won't get me into any trouble to try to help you save a little bit of money if you don't need me out there.
No, I've appreciated it because I've called you before as well, asking similar questions when our system doesn't turn on. Thankfully, my kids have shut off the furnace enough times that I've learned to look for it. I had a guy who once told me, he's like, everyone is installed upside down. He's like, what they should be doing is they should flip them so that they're only on when the button points down, because
Yeah.
that's how they get knocked off. Because we also have a switch down by the furnace, which is in the laundry room for us. So somebody goes and brushes against it or throws some clothes or a hamper or whatever, flip down, come upstairs, no heat, no AC, whatever it is. It's the first place I look. So 9 out of 10
Small
times.
covers. There's small covers that you can put in front of them where you can just access the switch from the side. So
Yep.
if, you would just basically have to put your finger in through the side to turn the switch up and down.
Yeah, I've seen those brackets. I see them typically on the staircase going up and down.
Yeah.
Maybe that's like a weekend project I'll take on, but I haven't yet, frankly. I'm just outside goofing off with the kids instead. So one of the other things I wanted to talk about is, listen, it's COVID-19 time. There's a lot of crazy stuff going on. Can you tell me, you guys are still working, right? You're an essential service.
Correct.
Somebody needs heat, they need heat. Or AC, you could be elderly, you need AC. You can't, you're going to be sweating in the house.
Mm-hmm.
What are you doing today to protect your clients, or how are you, servicing them during this difficult time?
Any houses that I go inside, I'm obviously maintaining all of that, the CDC guidelines for social distancing. I personally wear a mask when I'm inside of a house. Anything to prevent, airborne droplets from entering someone's house. And then not only that, but I wear booties on my feet just to make sure that I'm not necessarily tracking anything from another customer's home into your home. And when I'm done at your house, it goes in a bag, goes in the trash, and that's the end of that one. None of my stuff gets reused. The only thing that I reuse is the actual respirator that I use, but I clean that off after every time I leave a customer's house. But now's the biggest time that you want to start addressing air quality. The systems themselves aren't tested directly against COVID-19. However, they're tested on strains that are extremely similar to them. And usually if it's effective against a group of viruses, it's most likely going to be effective over time against one specific virus. So if you're concerned with anything airborne, pathogens, bacteria, viruses, those UV systems and any type of high intensity UV systems and air cleaners are going to be very effective against eliminating those things that you're worried about in your air.
Right. So that won't guarantee that you don't get sick, of course.
It won't guarantee anything.
But it does reduce.
It helps.
I assume it works on some level, because that's why they install those systems in hospitals, correct?
Correct.
Air quality is a huge thing in hospitals. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding that they've taken even a step further, and they say, like, in hospitals, they have all the airflow go from the hallway into the patient's room and then out the patient's room back into the ductwork to clean it, because they're trying to reduce the frequency that people get sick and transmit diseases. And what's the best way to do that but then to have the air go into the room where the sick individuals are versus all blowing out into the hallway. So your principle is along the same line. We go in, we'll suck all the air through, and if we run it through a system like a UV system, it helps kill them, which reduces the quantity, which reduces, the likelihood that you get sick. Like, we've had times in the winter where I've gone and bought the higher rated filter, me thinking, oh, if everyone's sick, well, hopefully we can catch it and get it out. I don't know if that works or not. It's not a UV light, but it's, the poor man's solution.
A lot of hospitals are also pressurized as well.
Okay.
So they'll slightly elevate that pressure to a positive level inside the space that you're walking around in. Not enough that you would really feel it, but in the event that a window opens, if you have someone that's immunocompromised, the last thing you want is, foreign bodies from outside coming in. So by raising that level, it will actually take the air from in the hospital and push it out to prevent that stuff from coming into the building.
Wow. I didn't know that. I know they do that in tanks, but that's to, avoid poison gas.
Yeah.
Slightly different environment.
I also send, I've done this prior to this pandemic, but all of my invoicing is done electronically.
Yep.
So if I come to your house tomorrow, say you had an air conditioner that you knew was bad,
yep,
and we decided to move forward with an update, I'm going to maintain as much distance as possible. I'm going to still do those same things that I normally would, wearing gloves, booties, and a respirator. I'll take all the equipment with me, change all your equipment out. You and I will not actually exchange the payment. I will send it to you, and whatever form of payment you want to go through with then, you can do it completely online. If you wanted to do a check, you would do an ACH transfer. If you wanted to do a credit card, you can do that all through the emails that I send as a receipt and an invoice to my customers.
Interesting. You really thought it through.
Tried to.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure people appreciate that. And I wanted to thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. If there's anything else you want to share, please feel free to jump in. And otherwise, I'm going to encourage people to reach out to you directly with their follow-up questions, because I'm sure they're going to have some, especially as their AC units, seize up at the start of spring.
Absolutely. I mean, if there's any advice I can give anybody right now, if you are on the edge of any type of work or updates, whether it's myself or somebody else, I would certainly get on their radar now, because I can already forecast it in my mind what the way that this is going to go and the time frame at which things are going to start to slowly reintegrate. It's going to be a flood in my field as far as work is concerned, because it's going to be very warm and everyone will start working all over again, and people will start being more comfortable with other people being in their house. So if you are in any type of a situation where you're able to do an update now safely, obviously, that's the operative term. If you have anybody that's sick, young, elderly inside your house, I'm obviously going to recommend against it. But if you can safely update your stuff now, I would do it sooner than later, rather than waiting until May and it's 85 degrees outside and everybody's slammed for the next 4 weeks.
Yeah, there's nothing worse than that, than needing a contractor and looking around and just saying everyone's booked out for a month or 2 months, and not much you can do at that point.
Nobody likes being in a hot house.
No, no, they do not.
All
No,
relationships get tested in the heat.
they do. Yeah, yeah. Oh, we could talk about that. I've read studies. As the heat increases, so does crime. Just saying.
Yeah,
Tempers,
sure does.
tempers get tested in the heat. So stay cool, stay friendly, and Anthony will help you.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I'll talk to you soon.
Talk to you then.
Bye-bye.